fellow Unitarian Universalists, it is an unbelievable honor to serve as your president of the Unitarian Universalist Association. I've experienced the first 10 months of this presidency as one filled with enormous gratitude, for it is a gift to serve our faith in this way. But it has also been a time of enormous heartbreak, challenge, and urgency. Just days after I arrived in Boston with my family, having packed up and driven across the country from Phoenix, the call came for faith leaders to show up in Charlottesville, Virginia. Local faith leaders, including your sibling Unitarian Universalists, called others to join them in fortifying an effort to stop white supremacist violence from descending on their town. Being in Charlottesville was terrifying and traumatic. Having spoken to a number of Unitarian Universalists who were there, we still carry the trauma of that day. A number of UUs were injured on the streets, and the activist Heather Heyer was killed. Even as the news cycle moves on, with each day's latest shock and tragedy, it matters that we not forget what happened in Charlottesville in August. Charlottesville revealed explicitly the violence and the dehumanization that undergirds racism, white supremacy, patriarchy, anti-Semitism, homophobia, transphobia, and xenophobia, all of which were on full and visceral display at that white supremacist rally. It made the power and the renewed boldness of these movements in our nation undeniable. And it revealed the federal administration, the police, and the state's complicity and protection of these movements. Now, to be very clear, this is not about individual police officers. People of inherent worth and dignity, people with families, loved ones, people in our congregations. This is about a system of policing in our country. And I want to be specific about what I mean about complicity and why I use that word, that the state and the police and the federal administration were complicit in protecting white supremacists. So as I and other faith leaders were gathered in an interfaith worship service at the Presbyterian Church in Charlottesville the night before the rally, white supremacists marched through the campus of the University of Virginia with fiery torches. They assaulted members of the Black Student Alliance, and then they marched on to the church to prevent we worshipers from leaving the building. And throughout this event, the police were nowhere. The police were similarly absent as men with long guns marched in front of the Charlottesville synagogue during services, shouting hate-filled Nazi slogans at the worshipers as they entered their sanctuary. And in fact, the synagogue had specifically requested that the police send protection. The police had agreed to send an officer and then did not. The next morning, the police again stood far back from the crowds, while right-wing volunteer militiamen acted as police for the event. So we faith leaders were standing face to face with well-armed men in surplus military gear, looking as if they represented the national government, with long guns and hundreds of rounds of ammunition strapped to their bodies. And as we stood face to face, the police were far on the other side of the park, behind where the rally was gathering. And then, as dozens and dozens of white supremacists came marching down the street, chanting and yelling with shields and helmets and bats and sticks, and came marching at the faith leaders and peaceful counter-protesters, the police were again nowhere and did not show up until violence had already broken out. Throughout the day, white supremacists continued to attack people of color on the street. It was terrifying. It was terrifying to see that level of hate. And it was terrifying to see it go completely unchecked by law enforcement. And I want to own the way that my deep shock at that is also a reflection of my own privilege, both white privilege and class privilege, that led me to assume that the police are in the business of protecting me, my body, my life. And that is not an assumption for all people in our country. Now, I've heard some people say that the police just didn't know what to do in Charlottesville. We should consider this for a moment. So in Charlottesville, when well-armed white men took to the streets to bring violence against a town, against faith leaders, against black members of the community, the police did not know what to do, so they stood back to give space for the supremacists to carry out their intimidation and violence. Armed people, and the police stood back and gave space. But in Ferguson, Missouri, when peaceful, unarmed black community members came out to march and mourn after the police had killed the young Michael Brown, they were met with a militarized police force armed with tear gas and riot gear and tanks. And we saw this again in Charlotte. And we see this happening across our country with militarized police forces showing up in our country to police citizens. This disparity between what happened in Charlottesville and what happened in Ferguson brings into sharp relief the reality that Black Lives Matter organizers have been naming for years about the racism and the broader system of white supremacy in our nation and its system of policing. And again, this is not about individual officers. This is about a system of policing that has been set up to preserve order Again, not about individual police officers. It's about a system that has been set up to preserve order in a broader society that is increasingly unequal, untenable, and oppressive, particularly against communities of color and the poor. So as injustice, inequity, poverty, and disparity grow in our country, so do our nation's investment in policing, jails, weapons, and warfare. And meanwhile, our investments in education, in mental health services, in programs that uplift the poor dwindle. We are increasingly relying on criminalization as a system to try to keep order in an increasingly unjust reality. It was important for me to be in Charlottesville as the national voice and leader of our faith, showing up for our values. But I wasn't there alone. Unitarian Universalists from throughout the South and East came to show solidarity. And the UUA, your UUA, was there not just in my presence, the UUA, I want you to know this, that the UUA was there not just in my presence, but actually in providing behind-the-scenes support on communication and logistics. And our staff stayed for the next week and two in Charlottesville to provide trauma response and pastoral care to organizers and community members. This is one of the ways that we are being called more deeply into living our faith, but another way that we can hold one another as UUs collectively across our country. I know from my own ministry in Phoenix, Arizona, deeply invested in the struggle for immigrant rights and combating the abuses of Sheriff Joe Arpaio, I know the power of the UUA and our shared faith when we show up for and with one another in these terrible moments and crisis of injustice. And I remember, Leslie, how you brought a whole gathering from your church to Justice GA in Phoenix to help us continue that campaign that ultimately led to the defeat of Sheriff Arpaio. So I felt held by you all. And unfortunately, we're facing more and more of these crisis moments, and more is being asked and called of us in this time. Almost daily, we see political and human rights attacks on communities of color, indigenous communities, and immigrants. We see the persistent attacks, both personal and political, on the transgender community, the gay, lesbian, and bisexual community, on Muslims and Jews, on women and our bodies and our safety, on the threats to take away health care from the poor and people living with disabilities, and in the very targeted crackdown against activists in both racial justice and immigrant justice movements. All of these things are unfolding daily. We add to this the increasing effects of global climate devastation. As you know, the fires and the mudslides here out west. And in the east, we know the floods and the rising sea levels. 50 years ago, Dr. King talked about living in the fierce urgency of now. The reality that the consequences of the decisions that we make today will have generational effects, that we do not have time to delay, that we need more courage, more love, more boldness, more capacity to take risks, to show up and fight for one another's humanity and for one another's safety and liberty. In this moment, as a people of faith that say we are committed to justice, compassion, and equity, a faith that says we are committed to the inherent worth and dignity of every person, a faith that says we are committed to respect for the interdependent web of all existence. More is being called from us, and we have a critical role to play in this time. Two things are abundantly clear to me in this moment. Number one, this is no time for a casual faith and no time for a casual commitment to your values and your religious community. And number two, this is no time to think that you are in this alone or that any of us are alone. We need one another now more than ever. So this is no time for a casual faith. As Unitarian Universalists, we are first and foremost religious communities, and religious communities that practice love as our foundation and our doctrine. And we are living in times of pain and heartbreak. And in this time, we need communities that remind us of our very humanity, because the politics and realities of this time are increasingly dehumanizing. Just this weekend, yesterday in fact, I was with Congresswoman Premila Jayapal from Seattle, who's the first Southeastern Asian immigrant congresswoman in this country, elected to the Congress. And she talked about how in this culture right now, human goodness is being completely disregarded as having any value. And we as a religious community are and have always been, from deep in our Unitarian and our Universalist roots, committed to fostering and nurturing human goodness. 50 years ago, Dr. King was asking what it would take for we as a nation to turn away from the giant evils of racism, militarism, and economic exploitation. He understood that all three of these things were interwoven: racism, militarism, and poverty. And he said that it would take a kind of powerful, unconditional, overflowing goodwill and love for all people. He called this kind of love agape love. And he said it could very well be the salvation of human civilization. King said of agape love that it is the love of God operating in the human heart. I invite you to just sit with that wisdom and translate that theism if you need to. It's okay. But feel the fullness of that message, that what is salvific in our lives as human beings is our capacity to love with a fullness that it might be described as the love of God operating in our own hearts. We so desperately need religious communities that call us and teach us and call us back to love with this fullness, this boldness, this courage. How to love unconditionally in the midst of propaganda and politics that tell us to be afraid. To be afraid of the future, to be afraid of change, to be afraid of one another. We also need communities where we can bring our heartbreak and our pain, and that we might be called back into a resiliency. I love in your own vision how you talk about restorative spiritual practices. This is where our faith is being called, to make room to really bring the fullness of our heartbreak and be called to resiliency. Be strengthened by the reminder that we're not in this alone and that others are holding us. When we stepped out onto those streets in Charlottesville, we knew that our safety could not be guaranteed nor expected. We had already seen how the police had failed to show up again and again, so we knew we were putting our lives at risk. Our faith, our knowledge that love is more powerful than fear, led us out there into the streets. But there was something else, and that was that we weren't out there alone. I was strengthened by the religious leaders who I stood with arm in arm, Christian and Jew and Muslim and Unitarian Universalist, showing up to side with love and witness for the power of a diverse and multicultural, loving future for our country. The challenges that we face right now, from economic inequality and racial injustice to global climate change, are calling for broad coalitions of people working together for justice. So now is the time for us to be more deeply invested in our relationships with each other, across our congregations, with the UUA, but also partnering more deeply with movements for liberation in our communities, partnering beyond our faith with folks who are on the front lines of these movements. Theologically, our universalism tells us that no one is outside the circle of love. And yet we must understand that in our lives and in the context of oppression and discrimination, that the circle never has been drawn wider from the center. It always has grown wider because of the vision, leadership, and organizing of people living on the margins who truly understand the limits and the cost of oppressive policies and know what liberation means and what it looks like. This is what made our work as Unitarian Universalists so powerful in Arizona, because we showed up deeply in partnership, following the lead of a movement led by undocumented immigrants and their families who are fighting for their dignity, fighting for their lives, fighting for their future. Those who continue to fight for their families and their future. We cannot, as Unitarian Universalists, live into the fullness of our theology unless we embrace deeply the work of liberation beyond our own walls. This time that we are living in is one of enormous opportunity. It really is. I have been so inspired by the teachers showing up in Arizona. I can't believe it, how long I waited for the teachers to show up and say enough of taking money out of schools and putting it into prisons. It's not just Arizona, it's West Virginia, it's Oklahoma, it's all across our country. So this time is a time of enormous opportunity. People are waking up. Not everybody's been asleep. I want to say that really clearly. But we need to remember our President of the U.S. did not come out of nowhere. He did not come out of nowhere. So this is a time of opportunity and deep needed change. And the health and strength of our communities and our commitment to our values and to this theology of love and interdependence is crucial. Because we're not just talking about a political struggle or an economic struggle. We are talking about a moral struggle. We are talking about our humanity and our capacity to live with compassion, live with one another in peace. And so we don't just need all the other work. We need to work in the political and economic field, but we need to nurture healthy religious communities that remind us of our humanity and call the best from us. And I know this time that we're living in will change us. It will change us as Unitarian Universalists, as Americans. But I also see that day when we will look back and see the measurable change in our hearts, in our congregations, in our faith, and in our society that were nurtured because of our courageous choices today. Now, this change won't come through optimistic hope or casual practice. It will take a deep commitment and generosity to communities that sustain courage and love, communities like ours, like yours, that are sources of both resiliency and resistance. It will also mean new ways of living our faith that help us have more impact, that help us reach out more boldly, lovingly, and faithfully with others for justice. And it will take each of us finding our place, finding our work, where our gifts can help call something new, something life-giving into this world. I recognize that we cannot all be on the streets. Although, again, I'm inspired by all the people who continue to show up on the streets. We need more people on the streets. But I also know that's not everyone's place. But we all have a role to play in nurturing healthy Unitarian Universalist communities that inspire and nurture and sustain the leaders of a liberating future. So thank you. Deep gratitude for each and every one of you, and for the way that you offer your love and commitment to this congregation and to our wider faith. As your president, I look forward to working more closely and in deeper partnership with you, for this is a time where our voice has never been needed more. May the spiritual community that we practice strengthen all of our hearts and give us courage. May our faith hold us as we follow new pathways of love and risk and joy that will fill our hearts with an agape love that will lead us to the liberation that we all need until all are free. May it be so. Amen.